Welcome to the Filmlings podcast.
An unfortunate podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 165, an overview of tragic cinema part 3, Tragedies of Fate.
Prepare to cry.
Yeah.
Prepare to be very sad.
This is probably going to be the saddest episode of this series. Potentially the saddest episode of our entire show. I don't know.
Yeah, the first part of this series was kind of about comeuppance. The second part was making you angry, and the third part is making you depressed.
Yeah.
This is some heavy stuff. We're going to have some interesting questions to answer at the end of it, along the lines of why would anybody make and or watch these, which I think is an important question. That kind of gets to the root of a lot of storytelling too.
Yeah.
And these extreme examples of movies that make you feel incredibly negative emotions like these are pretty key to answering that question. But it's not something you think about when you watch a comedy because you're like, obviously I'm having fun watching this. You watch one of these and you're like, oh God, why am I watching this? But it's so good.
Why did they make this? Yeah. Yeah. And so I think at least one of the films in this episode, I know a friend just found on a list of like movies that ruined my life listicle online. So brace yourself for that. But we'll get into
one of these movies just not too long ago was added to Netflix. Like I know that's where I found it. So and I heard some friends of mine talking about it and having seen it for the first time. And I thought it's funny that you're watching this now because we're about to do this on the podcast. But also it's well timed because a lot of people have not seen Grave of the Fireflies before. And now suddenly a bunch of people are watching it because it popped up on Netflix. So
I had no clues on Netflix. That's shocking, actually.
Yeah.
Because that's one that you would see. Like, I feel like the appeal of clicking on it from the poster is a lot.
Studio Ghibli. Yeah. You're like,
yeah,
oh,
it's
this
a
is
lot greater
fun and whimsical.
But if you have read anything about it or have heard anything about it, you will not click on it just so easily as you will as seeing two children in a World War II movie. So we'll get there. We'll get there, guys. But yeah, when we're talking about fate, now we're talking about something, again, like we were getting to in the last episode about injustice. This is something that's very kind of intangible. And so in the sense that we're using it here, these films are going to kind of fall more into the category of something like chance or accident rather than a mythological sense of fate like Oedipus or Macbeth or Julius Caesar, Beware the Ides of March. Not so much like destiny so much as just happenstance in a sense.
But still unavoidable happenstance.
Yeah, and so in the definition of accident or chance, it basically means the lack of intention or necessity. So really, these are circumstances brought on to the protagonist without their having any say one way or the other about it. And then really, it's just kind of how do they react? How do they kind of embrace those circumstances? Interestingly, though, in a story typical conflict type discussion, your conflict is typically something that has agency. We were talking about the struggle in the last episode, the agon, and there can't be much of a struggle if there's only one side. And so this is an interesting thing that's kind of unique to fate, because it is kind of immutable, intangible, struggle withable. But Alex, how many of the conflict types do you remember?
Man versus man, man versus nature, man versus self, man versus society, man versus God, man versus being turned into a caterpillar in the morning. But that's about all I remember.
Yeah, sometimes you'll see man versus machine.
Oh yeah.
which kind of goes along with
very
society.
modern.
Yeah. And then, fate and the supernatural are kind of intertwined, but kind of separate. I think it kind of depends how much the protagonist, addresses the supernatural. Like whether or not the protagonist sees it as a providential act kind of makes it more man versus God versus man versus fate kind of a situation. But interestingly, do you know where these come from, Alex?
Man?
No, these categorizations.
Oh, no. It's just something you hear about a lot, but I do not know the originator.
Guess what? Me neither. I cannot find a single source for where these come from. I think everyone just agreed that these are the conflict types. No one wrote them out, except for now every English teacher uses them to teach conflict. Interestingly, for whatever this is worth, Ayn Rand didn't believe in man versus nature because nature has no agency. And that's kind of the same situation we're in here. So it's interesting that there are some of these conflicts. Most of them are like yourself. You have choices to make with yourself, but sometimes you disagree or you don't act in your own best interest or whatever. And we talked about that in the first episode. And then other times, there's different levels of agency that you have or the protagonist has in the struggle. But man versus fate, man versus nature is something kind of different. So how do we make a story with a conflict where there's not anyone to struggle against? Well, in Aristotle, again, we're going through Aristotle's Poetics. And so let's see what he has to say about this. He has a little bit to say about it. So he's talking about, we've been talking through the purpose of tragedy is to arouse the feelings of pity and fear in various ways. And Aristotle says such incidents have the very greatest effect on the mind when they occur unexpectedly and at the same time in consequence of one another. So he's talking about plot and how each part of your plot has to relate to that which came before. So something happens which causes this to happen, which causes this to happen, which makes the story more compelling than just this happened and then this happened and then this happened.
The surrealist would like to see you in their office, please.
I know, right? And he literally calls that the episodic, where he breaks down like the parts of story, which I think we're going to get into in a little bit. But he continues, there is more of the marvelous in these events than if they happened of themselves or by mere chance. And then he says, even matters of chance seem most marvelous if there is an appearance of design, as it were, in them. And so then he goes on to describe some incident of a guy who, mocked one of the kings or one of the gods, and then a statue of that king or god fell on him and killed him. And it's like, that was kind of fateful, but also seems to be meaningful because of the coincidence. Because there's an appearance of design in those circumstances. So that's what we're going to be kind of looking through, is like seeing how the storyteller specifically finds those appearances of design in the occurrences that they're relating. And another idea that I want to bring in to this episode, because it's going to relate to some of these stories, is Aristotle's idea of two kinds of plot: simple and complex. And he says, plots in which the change in the hero's fortunes take place without peripety or discovery are simple, and when they do involve peripety and or discovery, they are complex. All right. I think I've mentioned peripety a couple of times in the last couple episodes.
Dude, you send me a text about peripety every 3 days. It's time to stop.
But I think it's interesting that peripety is not something that's like taught, at least not using that word so much in storytelling classes, at least the type of storytelling learning that I have been through. But Aristotle lays it out this way. A peripety is the change from one state of things within the play to its opposite of the kind described, and that too in the probable or necessary sequence of events. So for instance, in Oedipus, the opposite state of things is produced by the messenger who, coming to gladden Oedipus and remove his fears as to his mother, reveals the secret of his birth. So in Oedipus, I don't remember the exact message of the messenger, but Oedipus is like trying to make sure that he doesn't complete the
he tries to avoid his fate.
The destiny.
But in trying to avoid it, he meets it anyway.
Yeah, and that is all brought together in one moment when the messenger comes to say, hey, look, you avoided your fate. But the way that he tells it makes him realize, oh, I misunderstood, and I actually achieved my fate. And so that's like almost like we were talking about with the fairy tales series with Eucatastrophe, but it's mostly just the catastrophe part of it where things are turned upside down, but not just that things are changed, but that we were intending it to go one way and it actually went the opposite way. And so keep that in mind. We'll come back to that because that is very important for our first film of the day. But before we start talking about our first film of the day, what is it, Alex?
The first film of the day, well, it's a pretty happy one. It's called Ikiru from 1952.
Considering it's one of, well, no, I guess Titanic might be the happiest one. Ironically.
You know what I'm... Jonathan, how
you think we crap on
spicy
big
am
name
I allowed to be
directors
today?
last?
How mean can I be to James Cameron in Titanic? Let me know.
Alex, go for 2 thumbs downs. I'm
okay, let's do it. The happiest part of any movie today is when the credits roll on Titanic because it means you don't have to watch Titanic anymore. Anyway, the first movie we're talking about today is Ikiru from 1952, which translated is the verb that means to live. It is directed by Akira Kurosawa, written by Akira Kurosawa, Shinobu Hashimoto, and Hideo Oguni. It is one of the few Akira Kurosawa movies that's not a historical like samurai piece. There actually are quite a few from earlier in his career, but this is one of them, and it's very, very, very good. Somewhat inspired by Leo Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilyich, starring Takashi Shimura, who, if you don't know that name, you should. He's in like almost every Kurosawa movie up through the 80s.
There's so many Kurosawa faces in this film. It was great.
It really is. He's an older actor compared to the rest of the cohorts of the Kurosawa main cast, but he plays a lot of these older roles very, very, very well. It also stars Miki Odogari, Yonosuke Ito, and Nobuo Nakamura. Cinematography by Azakazu Nakai and music by Fumio Hayasaka. Then we're going to talk about another Japanese movie. They like making sad movies. Grave of the Fireflies from 1988, but directed by Isao Takahata, co-founder of Studio Ghibli, because it is a Studio Ghibli movie, which has fooled a lot of people into clicking on it on Netflix and not knowing that they were going to be as sad as they were. Written by
Listen
Isao
to this episode
Takahata.
before you watch this film on Netflix.
Yeah, just know. It's a great movie. It's worth your time, but it's sad. Based on the semi-autobiographical short story of the same name by Akiyuki Nosaka. I hope it's semi-autobiographical. Otherwise, how did they write it? I'm not familiar with the short story, so if you know more about it, I'll be curious to see what that light is. Starring for voices, Tsutomu Tatsumi, Ayano Shiraishi, and Akimi Yamaguchi. Cinematography by Nobu Koyama, and music by Nichio Mamiya. And then finally, we're going to talk about Titanic from 1997, which really kicked off the phase of James Cameron just copying a classic story and then doing a bunch of effects around it. Written by James Cameron, directed by James Cameron, inspired by the sinking of the RMS Titanic and Romeo and Juliet, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, Kate, back when it was appropriate for him to only date 20-year-olds, Kate Winslet, Billy Zane, Kathy Bates, and Bernard Hill. Cinematography by Russell Carpenter and music by James Horner.
All right.
I'm taking shots today, Jonathan. I don't care.
Alex doesn't like Titanic. Alex has nothing to lose.
There's 2 Leonardo DiCaprio movies back to back, week to week, that, he's a great actor, but I'm going to take some shots here and there too. So anyway, Jason, take it away for Ikiru.
Ikiru from 1952. Kanji Watanabe has wasted most of his life as a bureaucrat in the Tokyo Public Works Department. But when he learns that he is dying of stomach cancer and only has a few months left, he sets out to start living his life in earnest for the first time. After indulging in a series of hedonistic exploits with an eccentric novelist he meets at a bar, and later trying to learn the secret of happiness from a young coworker who has an inexplicable zeal for life, Kanji eventually decides to put all his efforts into one last major project: to build a park for a rundown area of town. Months later, at his funeral, various members of the city government reminisce about the mysterious change in Kanji's attitude and sudden enthusiastic energy that had come over him several months before his passing.
All right, Alex. So Ikiru, I thought was fascinating because when I was reading through Aristotle and this idea of peripety, and then Ikiru started, and in the first 30 seconds, the movie said, this movie's all about peripety. And I was like, cool.
Yeah, the narrator. That's right.
Yeah. So we start off. Actually, I think we see the X-ray of his stomach first.
Yeah, that's like the first shot. Yeah.
But then the narrator says, this is Watanabe. He's wasted his entire life, but he's about to find out that he has stomach cancer, and then he's going to start living for real. And that's peripety, Alex. The thing that was supposed to be the death sentence for him is actually the wake-up call to start living his life. And that is what this entire movie is based around. And it works out so good.
Yeah, it's a really lovely contrast movie. Because Watanabe starts the movie like everybody else in this sense, but everybody's kind of either living life defensively or waiting for something and they don't know what they're waiting for. Or like his son who's just waiting for his dad to die. Or to retire so he can take the bonus so that he can begin his life. Or everybody else at the office who's living essentially defensively to protect their position, but also they're not living for it, doing anything with their life other than living defensively. So they're not living for anything. So he kind of goes through like this existential philosophical journey where he tries to find all these different ways to live that might work for him. And over the course of it, he actually does explore like a few different life philosophies, like the idea of living for love or living hedonistically, all sorts of different ways. And then, of course, Kurosawa does a lovely contrast by showing that even just, not only is he experiencing this existential crisis, often in the backdrop of people living their lives, or like, for instance, in that one scene where he's talking to the young woman who's going to go make toys, and while he's walking down the stairs, everyone else is singing happy birthday or a celebration of life, essentially, to their friend. There's lovely contrast like that. But also, even in just trying to find a way to live, he is effectively living. So way more than he was when he was just kind of living very passively at his death.
Yeah, and along those lines, like the structure of this film is fascinating. It probably breaks like 100 screenwriting rules, but it works. So we have the moment of discovery, like he realizes that he has stomach cancer pretty early, even though which is also done in a really interestingly roundabout way where the doctor won't tell him that he has stomach cancer, but the dude in the waiting room is like, if the doctor tells you this, 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 and this, that means you have stomach cancer. And so he realizes he only has a few months to live. And so then the first thing he does is he goes to a bar and starts drinking, which is a big no-no if you have stomach cancer. But then he meets this novelist who takes him on this tour of Tokyo and all the hedonistic pleasures that he can enjoy there. And the novelist calls himself Mephistopheles, or he says, I'll be your Mephistopheles. I'll be the good Mephistopheles for you. Mephistopheles is the name of the character that Faust sells his soul to in the Faustian story, which is interesting because this novelist has this like really like dark, weird aesthetic to him. And so he makes a joke of it, but he really is kind of this Mephistopheles of, you can give yourself up to all of these things, but ultimately as Watanabe realizes, like they're all just kind of empty. Like you could do this night after night after night, but there's nothing else after that. And then, he has this whole section where he is hanging out with the young girl from the office who just has this inexplicable zeal for life, and he's trying to figure out what her secret is. He's like, tell me the secret to living. She's like, whoa, back off.
Yeah, he's so intense during that scene. And you understand why he's so intense. But also, yeah, you get why she's so creeped out. That's such an intense thing to be asking another human.
Yeah.
Yeah. Especially someone who isn't in the same position, not by a wide margin. So
yeah. And the other thing that is really interesting about the film is that Watanabe never tells anyone that he's dying. So every encounter that he has as he's trying to, live his life to the fullest, no one knows that he knows he's on a ticking clock, which comes in at the very end. But then, that section, this is all the first half of the film. And this section, for some reason, reminded me a lot of our conversation of Groundhog Day, because it's kind of that, like, what do you do when you have nothing to lose? And we talked about how in Groundhog Day, he kind of goes through like all the 7 deadly sins, like all the things that you could indulge in. And then he has to like get it out of his system and then get on with actually trying to live the best life that he can. And we kind of get the same sort of a thing here too. Not that I ever thought I would compare a Bill Murray movie to a Akira Kurosawa film.
Well, I think Bill Murray finds a very similar answer, though, right? Like he finds that one of the best things to do is to work on the effort of improving yourself and the place around you as much as you can. That's where you kind of that sense of growth, that sense of purpose, that sense of amelioration of like slow gains over a long period of time. That's a very satisfying thing to experience, and maybe one of the most fulfilling things to experience. So I think Watanabe feels something very similar. And even though he obviously, he dies, he does leave behind this playground. He leaves behind something that he worked hard on that made the world around him a better place, only in a small way. But compared to all of the other bureaucrats that work around him and don't do anything or accomplish anything in their day-to-day, it's a huge
Unless
victory.
It'll help them get promoted.
Yeah. And just imagine, and even then, like at the end, like just imagine if all those bureaucrats looking down at the playground in the final shots did that over the course of their whole lives, how good the city could become.
Yeah. Yeah, and so that's the second half of the film. So right in the middle point of the movie, Watanabe dies. And then the rest of the film takes a 90-degree turn, and suddenly we are at his funeral, and all of his co-workers in the city hall are there, and they're all talking about him. And so we get the rest of the actual part of Watanabe's life where he starts living and doing his job to the fullest. We get that all through the reminiscences of his coworkers, most of whom are trying to badmouth him because they feel intimidated by him. In the words of Hot Fuzz, "You're making us all look bad." So now we are experiencing the outcome of the life that Watanabe lived in those last few months when he started doing the Parks Project. And I think that that's really one of the big points of the film is because when we're talking about downer movies, is like we have to think about what is the like, why are we making this film? What do we want the audience to take away from this film? And I feel like in this one, especially talking about fate, this is a very proactive approach to fate. This is Watanabe realizes he has to live his life in a certain way with a certain zeal. And then what is left is what is the legacy of that life that he lived, even for the last 4 or 5 months of his life. And so the enduring legacy of a life well lived is kind of the final takeaway of the film.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think about the figure standing on the bridge at the end of the film? It's relatively nondescript, because I think the other people looking down on the playground are bureaucrats in the building, but it almost feels like Watanabe's ghost.
Yeah.
Or maybe just a stand-in for anybody who could be in a similar position with a bureaucratic trench coat and hat. No,
I definitely got the sense that it was kind of a ghostly, like it It has a very similar sense to, I don't know how common of a device this is, but I've been to like productions of Shakespeare on stage. And at the end, when Shakespeare will bring out the ghosts or as people die, they go to these rafter spots and they kind of look down on the rest of the play, or they come back at the end and they're in the rafters looking down. That's what it felt like. It felt like a very theatrical thing. And we know, obviously, that Kurosawa is a big Shakespeare guy. And so I can kind of see that being brought in there.
Yeah, that's right. Didn't Shakespeare write a lot of stuff with the balcony involved?
Yeah, he wrote a couple famous things about a balcony.
Well, I don't mean that scene. I mean, the balcony was an established part of the Globe Theater that he uses as a function in a lot of his plays.
Yeah. So I can definitely see that. But yeah, I just think that shift from the first person to all of a sudden we're getting a lot of the story through flashbacks and intercut with the perspectives of the workers. But then you have there's almost another element of tragedy, because there's the way this is structured is so crazy, because at the funeral you have most of the bigwigs sitting there and they're talking about how, well, Watanabe didn't do that much. We're really the ones who did it. He couldn't have done it without us. And then they all take their hats and leave. And then all the subordinate people are talking, and they're like, well, if he hadn't pushed them to do all these things, they wouldn't have done anything. And he had to go to every single department and he had to get this thing done. And so then all the subordinates are just like getting more fired up, and they're getting a little drunker, and they're all like, we need to live our lives to the fullest, and we can't stand to just waste our lives in this park department. It sucks the soul out of you. And then you have the one scene where they go back to work, and then the new guy who's in Watanabe's position denies another motion for some kind of thing. And the one guy who is the most fired up stands up and looks at him, and everyone looks at the guy, and no one says anything. And then he just sits back down, and the camera lowers, and the pile of paperwork covers his face. And that's the end. And it's like another tragedy of the bureaucracy that has just buried another potential living person. It's like the girl calls him the mummy. It's like they are all mummies buried under their paperwork.
Oh, he calls himself a mummy, doesn't he?
No, because she has that whole thing where she's like, I have nicknames for everyone at the office.
Oh,
and then
that's where
he
it
has
comes
to
from.
make
And then
her,
he uses it again in the scene later.
Yeah,
where he's asking
he
her to help
adopts
this
it.
mummy. Yeah, she had some brutal nicknames for people. Just get wrecked. Just based opinions on them.
Yeah.
Jelly Noodle. I was kind of bummed that we didn't see her at the end, but it also makes sense that we didn't see her at the end, because she's the whole point is that she's out living her life.
Yeah.
Not thinking about living life. She just does it.
Yeah. The whole thing with her storyline is that then there's the misconception of the son and the uncle or whatever, who think that now he has this young girl, and that's what gave him all of his pep to his step and stuff like that. And so they kind of misconstrue this relationship. And I don't know if he actually realized that they misconstrued the relationship, but he never says anything.
Yeah, he does not pay any attention to it. She's worried that he's being like creepy in a romantic, sexual way, but he's just not paying attention to that at all.
Yeah.
He's just enjoying being around like a young person full of life while he's dying. And wants to learn her secrets of how to live a happy life. But the secret is there is no secret. There's you just live life, whatever that means to you.
Yeah, and that's what one of the subordinates at the funeral, they're like, he must have known that he was going to die or something like that, or else why wouldn't he? But then one of them says, but any of us could die at any minute. And I'm like, oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's the point.
Yeah. They're all like, good for him. Oh, wait a second. That's not just a thing for him.
Yeah.
So, yeah, in terms of the tragic element, like this is the only one that is 100% fictional. I mean, except for the fact that this happens to people all the time in terms of them finding out they have cancer and figure out how you have to go on with that. But again, it's just like, it's more of just, what happens when you finally have this realization of mortality in like a way that kind of hits you in the face and wakes you up. But the way that the story is told, again, it has a narrator. And I think each of these films has a very specific kind of use of narrator. But this is the only one that's completely detached. So it's almost like Kurosawa imposing himself on the story, guiding us through it. And in that sense, I was thinking, well, since I'm thinking about Aristotle and Greek storytelling, but is the modern use of narrator kind of like the ancient use of the chorus to guide the story?
I mean, it's kind of what the chorus was, right? It was just narration.
It was usually
it was an omnipotent point of view.
Yeah.
I mean, the most modern use of narration is when it's a character narrating their own story.
Right, which is what we're going to see in the next two films. But yeah, in this way, it's almost like, I don't know. I think that probably the structure, since it's so unusual, kind of necessitates a little bit of guiding and prompting, so that, because it's about the release of information, right? The cancer diagnosis is not supposed to be a shock to the audience. So if we know it in the first 30 seconds, then we're just watching, the reactions to that. And, the fact that he dies and the way he dies is not supposed to be a shock. So if we get that halfway through, then we're just getting the aftermath, and we're kind of piecing together the ways that it came about. And so I just think that the story structure of this film is pretty brilliant. That's what I was thinking. The other film that we've talked about, I'm sure there's plenty, but the other one that I was just thinking about, the eminence of death kind of waking up to living life, is Joe versus the volcano, of all things.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Where he literally just gets like a fat stack of cash to go do whatever he wants with for a little bit.
Yeah, and then jump in a volcano.
But yeah, it's a very common kind of thing. This one is just very grounded. But I think that guiding of the narrator makes it very much like I don't know, it's a little more moralistic than the other ones we're going to talk about, which is fine. It's one of the ways that makes a film like this kind of digestible. And so we're going to talk about other ways. This is the middle spot, because I think in the next one we're going to find the way that you make a story like this, but it ends up being really, I don't know why I'm using food puns, but it ends up being very like sour and bitter. And then in the last one, it's very sweet and saccharine. And this one's like right in the middle there somewhere.
Yeah, I guess the interesting thing is that the morality displayed was always within Watanabe, but there was no reason for him to bring it out until he realized that his time was finite. So that's interesting, because it doesn't necessarily even say that, hey, your morality must be such and such. It just said, it just kind of showed a natural fiber within him that was revealed under pressure.
Yeah. I think what I'm getting at, and I'm trying to save stuff for overall notes, but there's an aspect of the way that the story is told in which you get the sense that like Kurosawa and his and the other writers are saying like, this is the best case scenario, right? Like this is, you get that diagnosis, and then, or you get that realization of your mortality, and you wake up and you start living your life. Like this is the best case scenario of that kind of thing. Not necessarily saying that's what you should do, but it's like, this is a desirable path forward, I guess.
Yeah. All right. Well, in that case, in the interest of saving more stuff for overall notes, let's go on to the next one. Grave of Fireflies from 1988. Jason, take it away.
Grave of the Fireflies from 1988. After an air raid in Japan during World War II, Seita and his young sister, Setsuko, find themselves suddenly orphaned. When they travel to live with relatives, they find a less than warm welcome by their aunt, who treats them as burdens and unfairly gives them smaller rations of food than she does to her daughter and their lodger. When tensions between Seita and his aunt come to a head, Seita takes his mother's savings and finds a secluded shelter near a pond where he and Setsuko try to live on their own for as long as they can, with only themselves and their slowly dwindling supply of money and food to rely on.
This is still a tough watch.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a beautiful movie. It is a tragedy through and through.
It has all the tragedies in it. I think I was going through all the types of tragedy that we're talking about, and I think it has all of them. It has tragedy of self, injustice, fate, betrayal. I'm not so sure about misunderstanding, but it's got a lot of tragedy rolled up into this one story.
It does kind of have an element to it too, like from the first episode we did, where Saita it kind of refuses help from a certain point.
Yeah, he definitely has a kind of pride.
Yeah, out of his own pride, like that hubris type deal going on. And certainly the sense that like this is just such a hard system. Even if he didn't, there isn't a guarantee they would survive. When your country's being firebombed like that at the end of a war, it's not a guaranteed thing for anybody. So it was going to be tough, that's for sure.
I think one of the hardest things about watching this film, because I know I've talked with my brother about it and stuff like that, and one of his things is that he hates the miscommunication aspect where there's, you know, if he had just gone back and talked to his aunt and tried to make it better or whatever, then things would have turned out differently. But I think there's something about watching a movie like this where there is a decision that's made that seems so counterintuitive. Like there is some kind of mental disconnect between like where we sit on the couch watching a Studio Ghibli movie and the lived experience of being in World War II in Japan, where death is imminent, where there's, there's so many different things that could happen with absolutely no warning. But doing some of the research on it, it's really interesting to kind of hear the headspace of the author and then the director. So the author talks about how Seita decides to become the guardian of his little sister after their mother dies, even if it means making an enemy out of the world. And that's kind of what you get, because one of the things that I think like the aunt doesn't have any sympathy for is the fact that, because her whole thing is that he doesn't work, he's not bringing in any like material benefit to the household, but he's also taking care of a 4-year-old, and like that takes a lot of work. Like, is she going to take care of this 4-year-old? I don't think so. I wouldn't trust her with her.
That is true.
And then there's the director, and this is just coming off of Wikipedia. I don't know the exact like quotations or stuff, but I think it gives a good sense of where the director was coming from. And so Takahata was interested in the fact that Seita decides to withdraw rather than stoically enduring his difficult feelings. And he says that Seita's feelings were better understood by the children in 1987, who often based decisions on whether or not they were pleasant, while at that time, people in the director's generation had the belief that Seita needed to endure it, which I understand the sense that, like, yeah, he should have just gone back, had that hard conversation with his aunt, and just endured if it meant, survival. But Seita instead chose to withdraw and try to make it by on his own. But there's just this really interesting thing that I feel like, I'm not a sociologist and I may be getting this wrong, but there is definitely a sense from watching some of these classic Japanese films that you get of characters just enduring really difficult emotions without talking about them. And so that, which seems to be kind of the norm for a certain type of person in Japan in a certain time period, but this different choice that Seita makes makes that kind of unique. So it's almost like Japan has a long history of an honor culture where you endure for the good of the family, for the good of the clan, for whatever. Whereas as Japan begins to modernize some, it's a little more of the individualist type of mindset. And I think that's kind of part of the tension that is felt in this film in a really heightened sense. Does any of that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. The learned behaviors are clashing with survival instincts.
Yeah. Because I think probably like his aunt would have expected him to, in an honor culture, just, take the poor rations. Like she's being unjust to him, but typically, in that culture, you would just accept the injustice and move on without saying anything and just kind of bottle it up. But he decides not to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's what I don't remember how old they're supposed to be. I know the girl is really, really young, and he's not that much older.
I think she's 4. And
he's 4. He's like 10, right?
In my mind, he's, like 12, maybe.
Maybe 12. Right on that cusp of preteen, like teenage years, but not truly that. So, like, he's also approaching it from the decision-making standpoint of, like, a 12-year-old.
Yeah.
Right? Like what you were talking about, where, like, this feels bad, this feels good. So, he's asked, it's such a difficult position to navigate. And say what you will about the aunt, the one thing that you can say is that while she will help them stay alive, she's not necessarily advocating on their behalf. And so he's still left alone in his decision-making process as to what's best for him and his sister. And in that scenario, no one's going to be best equipped to make a good decision, and let alone a 10-year-old who just lost his mom and also has to take care of a 4-year-old. So he's faced with like a seriously impossible task that he's probably gonna fail at, and he does. And that's part of the tragedy of it, is that he didn't mean to. He meant to do the best for him and his sister. He did everything he thought he could in his power. He really, really did. But it still wasn't enough. Or maybe he made the wrong choices. And that's one of those things that it was kind of an Ikiru too, is like the Monday morning quarterbacking of these tragedies of like, when it comes to something that's like fate, right? That's defined as unavoidable. What could I have done to escape it? Was there some way to have avoided this tragedy? And oftentimes there really isn't. Something like stomach cancer could be caused from a life of drinking. It could also just be random. Maybe they would have survived if he had done something more mature than a 10-year-old, most 10-year-olds are capable of doing, and stayed with his aunt. Or maybe they wouldn't have. Maybe that house would have been bombed next. I mean, their house was bombed and his mom died. There's no reason that couldn't have happened to his aunt's house too. Yeah. So, it's one of those things, like how it's dealing with the unavoidable, the things that just happen in life. So that's kind of what we're getting to here. And we assign the definition of bad to them, but really they're just things that happen, and we have to deal with them in some way, shape, or form. And in the face of that inevitability, how do we react? And that's one of the saddest things about this, is that you see Saita reacting as best as he can, but his best isn't good enough. Yeah.
Again, he does have somewhat of a proactive approach to his fate, in the fact that he's going to try and live on his own and support his sister. But I guess also in terms of Aristotelian tragic character development, it's an error of judgment. And so, like you're saying, he tried, but maybe it was the wrong move. Again, maybe it wasn't, because the element of randomness was so heightened at that period of time that it's really hard to say which is the best course and which wasn't. But it is really interesting that once he, for lack of a better word, emancipates himself and they're living at the pond, there's no one to tell the story. So the story is, and it's, again, the story is guided by the ghost of our protagonist, of Seta. And at the very beginning, we see him die. We see his ghost reunited with his sister. And then we get the entire story of their life from the period of the bombing to up till the point where his sister dies. And then the point where he dies is kind of neither here nor there. Although there's another ironic twist where it's like he dies 2 days before the Allies show up or something like that. But yeah, so we have this chorus, which is one of the characters, but looking back on their life. But really, other than that, it's like there's this really interesting element to me of like there are probably so many casualties in a war like World War II, obviously, that there are these stories, but nobody knows them, right? Because, there's no one to know. And so this is a really
That's why
interesting...
I was so confused when you said this is autobiographical in the summary at the start of the show.
Yeah, so the author his survived one of the bombings. And I think he had two sisters actually die of malnutrition. And I think there was a period where he was trying to get food for one of his sisters and stuff, but he says that he gave Seta a little bit more of the noble qualities than he actually had, where Seta would buy or steal the food and then bring it back for his sister. But the author said that he would basically just get the food and then just eat it just because he was so starving. And so he wrote it as something of an apology letter to his sister, I think he said. But it's coming from a really dark but real place. And apparently there's also, he also describes it as a double suicide story, which apparently is at least some kind of subgenre of Japanese storytelling, or at least there's this one author who has some stories along those lines. But it's almost like he's like, I would rather die on my own than live under the thumb of my aunt. So it's almost an acknowledged suicide, but not quite. It's like the suicide is a possible option, but it's better than the other option of living in a way that is undesirable.
But also as a kid, maybe he doesn't really understand the things he's saying there or thinking there.
Right. Yeah. I mean, again, it could be acting in his not his best interest. But he doesn't know. I mean, how many 10-year-olds have tried to run away anyway, just like in normal life? But I think one of the things that makes this movie really hard to watch,
the dying kids?
Well, yes, the dying kids. But even more than that is the fact that this one in particular is tragedy without an appearance of design. That quote unquote appearance of design that makes matters of chance seem marvelous or adds to the storytelling, like Aristotle talked about. It feels very pointless by the end, which is kind of the thing that the other, like any other type of film that you do, it's a really hard sell to not have some kind of moral or romanticism or something to this. It's just, and that was it. That's what happened. And it feels so pointless. And I think that is the hardest thing to watch in a story. And that's what makes you feel like, why did I watch this? What was the point? There was no point in a sense, or at least not evidently, not blatantly.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of what we're seeing in this movie is, as callous as it might sound, side effects of something much larger, without this specific of an intent to these people. And we're so used to, in movies and stories, seeing an antagonism being something specific, that to see it be something almost like a force of nature, man versus nature, like what you were talking about, man versus fate, is almost horrifying in the incomprehensible sense, because humans are so used to directly associating meaning that seeing it not be associated with anything, seeing the negative just exist on its own, is weird and unsettling, and we don't know how to confront it without it having a direct face. And they do that in this story because the bombings happen, but a lot of the fear and anger isn't necessarily directed at the planes themselves, or the people in the planes. Even it's
not like an anti-Allies propaganda film.
No, it's just it's like a survival story of shrinking choices to be made, and desperate decisions, and a really dark choose your own adventure where you choose probably some wrong things. I mean,
it's choose your own adventure, but it's the Oregon Trail.
Yeah, but you get dysentery in the end for sure.
I think that because obviously if you don't see the meaning, you want to find a meaning. And I think really what kind of the storytellers are getting at is, like, as opposed to in the first film where the meaning is the legacy of the life lived, I feel like the meaning in Grave of the Fireflies comes from the every moment counts kind of a thing, the living every moment in the present. There are so many moments, and this is what Studio Ghibli is best at. It's about taking time to enjoy the small moments, the little things, even in the midst of chaos and misery, where they're catching the fireflies in their little mosquito nets. Or I think what really drives it home too is after the sister dies, and then you're just kind of seeing the empty little hut where they lived, and then the sister kind of fades in and out, and she's playing and she's jumping and running, and just kind of it's reminding you of the enjoyment that was there. And the sadness comes from it being gone, but the film is almost saying, remember that there was the joy, and the joy had meaning while it was there. And I think that's, I don't know, maybe I'm trying way too hard to get more out of it, but I do think that Studio Ghibli does a really good job of heightening those emotions of the joy of the present. And they do that through their art, through the spectacle of their films, and through the storytelling and their character development and all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think of the ending shot of seeing the two kids as happy spirits overlooking the modern day city of Kobe?
I mean, I think that too is an element of digestibility in a sense. Like the other thing is that, they're together now. And so
yes,
that's, you get that at least. Yeah.
Yeah. They're, I was about to say, it's Studio Ghibli too. There needs to be an element of supernatural somewhere. And we didn't really get like spirits over the course of the movie. And normally there's something, magic or spirits or something in a Ghibli movie. And we didn't get that until the very end. But it was there. It was there. And it is, I don't want to say a happy ending, but has some sense of darkly tragic whimsy to it.
Is resolved, I guess. Yeah, and it was very just like they are together now. They're in the same place. It wasn't a very it wasn't like a mythological type of ending. It was just very simple.
Yeah, I think it is honestly, like, as tragic as it is and as many choices as you can nitpick in, or like not nitpick, but try to look for ways out for these kids over the course of the movie, which is part of the tragedy as well that you're engaging with as an audience, is trying to find a way to save them, but you can't either, because you didn't make the movie. But part of it is that it is honestly a quite straightforward story, but the themes are so deep and the emotions are so deep that you feel as you hope for these kids and empathize so heavily with them, that you still engage with it quite deeply, and it builds itself into enough to stand as a movie.
Yeah. Don't empathize too much with them. That gets really dark.
Well, I think it's unavoidable, and I think it's one of the reasons why we watch tragic movies like this, both in terms of like one of the reasons we like negative stories as humans might be that we empathize with other humans, but also because we naturally, if we hear of a dangerous situation, we're prone to put ourselves into that dangerous situation and think, what would we do in that? And in something like Ikiru, that might be the idea of like, oh, well, what if I did find out I only had 6 months to live? What would I do with that time? And the point of the story is to try to get you to think of the answer to that question and then start doing that now, whether or not you have 6 months left to live. And the Grave of the Fireflies is like, hey, what are my values? What am I willing to die for? What literal hill am I willing to die on? Because the kids pretty much, well, one of them dies on hill. But yeah, what are you willing to do in the face of that tragedy? What are your values? Because that really gets to the core of who you are as a person at the end of the day. When you're in a situation like that, that's where you find out what you're made of. So, yeah.
Yeah. All right. With all that, Alex, let's take a deep breath so that you can survive the vortex. And let's get into Titanic, shall we?
Oh, I didn't. A Rose can die in the water. I'm shoving her off. I'm climbing on the door.
All right, Jason, take it away.
Titanic from 1997. When a diving team finds a sketch of a woman wearing a valuable gem in the wreckage of the RMS Titanic, the woman in the drawing, Rose, joins the expedition and tells the story of her experience on the ill-fated ship. On the first evening of the trip, Rose escapes her high-class family and companions, including her fiancé, in an unhappy marriage of convenience, and contemplates jumping off the ship. She is stopped by a vagabond artist named Jack Dawson, and over the next few days of the trip, they form a romance while evading the disapproval of Rose's family and social circle. When the ship suddenly hits an iceberg, Rose has to make a final decision to either escape with the other first-class passengers in the limited lifeboats, or to tie her fate to the man she loves and together try to endure the sinking of the unsinkable Titanic.
All right, do I need to let you get anything out of your system before we start, or is there no helping it?
No. I mean, I don't think there's anything I need to rant about this movie. I think it's pretty basic, but I don't think that makes it bad. I think it gets a lot of undeserved hype, and I think that's I think that's also well known. I think that's a really common storyline around the movie too. It's like, oh, it's just really popular, but not necessarily as great or fantastic as the hype around it was when it first came out. And I think it's kind of escaped the zeitgeist a little bit because it is quite old now. I mean, it's creeping up on being 30 years old in 3 years. Yep. So it's going to be, it's not nearly as prevalent as it was. But there was a time where you would talk about movies and somebody always brought up Titanic as being one of the best movies ever made. And I think that's not true. And I don't think a lot of people have that opinion anymore. But here it is. Here's Titanic.
Yeah, I think what this film does is I'm kind of like in the back of my mind, I've been working through like a theory of like the way that different people kind of approach or experience different types of media. And I think that there's one track where it's kind of an edificial activity to engage with art, and on another track there's a kind of aesthetic approach where it's like, as long as the film makes me feel something, then it's good. And so you can artificially hype feelings really easily. And I think that that's what a lot of these kind of high drama, like especially this blockbuster era of Hollywood. I mean, obviously this is done a lot in classic Hollywood too and stuff like that. But what the film does is it just hypes drama and it hypes aesthetic and it just creates a lot of feeling. And I think just to kind of cut to the chase on some of the overall thoughts on this film is that like there's again not a lot of meaning that you can pull out of something like the sinking of a ship where like 60% of the people died. And so it has to be heavily painted on top and it has to be superimposed by the storyteller. And James Cameron does that on a lot of dimensions. And that's probably one of the strengths of the film is that there are a lot of really textbook examples of drama woven in here. And the amount of layers is kind of what makes it, you know, what it is. Like that's kind of what makes it epic is that it's not just about the sinking of a boat.
Yeah.
It's also about these class struggles and it's about true love and star-crossed lovers and this damaged pride and all these kinds of things. And the fact that they're all kind of packed in there gives it an amount of heft, even if it doesn't necessarily have like a super formidable literary foothold, if that makes sense.
No, it's pretty. It's just a James Cameron thing. It's not making very deep literal like metaphors is not his thing, but he's very good at weaving them together, so it works. You know, people always talk about Avatar kind of just being Pocahontas, but in space. And Titanic is kind of just Romeo and Juliet, but on a boat that sinks. But also, like, it works. It works. And the fact that, like, you were talking about, like, he was able to weave it all together with the big action sequences, because he loves his big action sequences, is one of the things that makes it, you know, function as a really, really good movie. The fact that it could have been so easily have done that they had the cheap romance plot and then that all went away for a 30-minute final sequence where the boat sinks and everyone tries to survive in a big action sequence, and then we go back to the romance plot at the last minute. But no, he weaves it through. There's time for all of those dramatic beats throughout and character development in every single scene. It all happens. It's all very technically well done, and it's a very good movie. But it also is, ironically enough, because it is kind of using a boilerplate love story, not a little shallow, maybe? Like, it has, like, it's really strongly performed characters and acting and stuff, but there's not a lot of meat to chew on the bone, if that makes sense. There's not a lot to ruminate about, like you're left with Ikiru or Grave of the Fireflies. So you kind of just watch it and you're done with it. And like you were saying, Jonathan, when you were talking about how people watch different movies or TV shows, sometimes, actually, probably most of the time, that's what people want. And that's fine. That's great. Good. Enjoy the movie. But also it makes it different than the other two movies we're talking about today. But when we're talking about, to bring it to a different point and maybe something a little more on topic, when we're talking about the point of tragedy and what the other two movies showed us and then what Titanic showed us, is what do you value when the chips are down? When fate comes knocking and you might die, what are you going to do? And this movie spends like the first half of it setting up all these characters and like really doing a good job of showing these characters performing their ideas of self. And then in the back half, showing us what these characters really value, what they really are willing to do when life is on the line. You know, who's going to be the person who sticks to their values? Who's going to be the person who cheaps out and kidnaps a child to get on a lifeboat? You know, all that stuff. Are you the musician who goes down with the ship, or the captain who goes down with the ship out of a sense of duty? Are you the designer of the boat who clearly fucked up pretty bad? Like it's so bad. Like of all, it's such a funny role because it's like playing the man with the biggest screw up ever in the history of screw ups.
It's honestly, his performance is great because it is so tragic to watch his face realize what a big mistake happened.
You ever, it's like, I mean, I think everybody who's ever worked any job ever has always had the moment of like, if I cut this corner, will anyone really notice? Would anyone really notice? And
I think the other thing though is
in this
that
case,
like,
yes.
but it was more than that. It was like they've taken all these precautions. They were talking about how like the one major corner that they cut was the lifeboats, which was a huge deal. But like the ship itself had a lot of precautions taken to avoid any kind of thing like this. But it's like if one iceberg hits you in just the right way and knocks out just enough of these walls, then we're screwed. And that one thing happened.
Yeah. No, it's yeah, that's what makes it tragic. I mean, it's a tragic historical event. It just has that association with it already, right? So
yeah,
it's kind of a perfect fit for one of these movies. Plus, I mean, there is the element too that makes it perfect for fictionalization is the idea that there were people who survived the boat, but so many mini stories happened to so many people who died that just like in Grave of the Fireflies, there's a bajillion untold stories on the boat.
Yeah.
I was actually seeing something the other day that was talking about how one of the more common finds on when people explore the Titanic shipwreck, which James Cameron loves to do, is probably one of the reasons he made this movie, is finding shoes, and the shoes are always found in pairs because they were just on people's feet, and over time the bodies decomposed and went away, but the shoes stayed because they were treated and covered in chemicals. So yeah, all those shoes have a story behind them. They all experienced something terrible that night and are still down there.
Yeah. Oh, there was such a sad moment. So this is actually just kind of ironic because I've been looking into some fairy tales and folklore and stuff, but there's a moment where this mom is like tucking her kids into bed, like, cause she knows they're not letting them up. And so they, when they're showing all the people who've just kind of resigned themselves to stay in their rooms, and she starts telling them the story of Tir na Nog. She's an Irish mom. A Tir na Nog is a story in Ireland mythology of either an island that appears now and then disappears whenever sailors try to get close to it, and it's where all the fairies live, or it's a city at the bottom of a lake, where this city has been buried, but now all the people still live there under the water. And I was like, oh, that's so sad. But yeah, so there is a lot of really good elements to this. And one thing that makes it great in terms of a tragedy of fate, and again, I'm superimposing these categories on these films that we're talking about, but it is a nice element in Titanic that we have the element of fate in the fact of the sinking of the boat, but we also have superimposed a story of fate on top of it, which is the star-crossed lovers, which is one of the like classic fate kind of things. Like they're just literally the term star-crossed lovers, which comes from Shakespeare. Like the stars are not aligned right for them to be together. So it's like against their fate for them to ever, come together. And so there's that extra element. But then again, we have, there's a lot packed into it.
Okay. Can we talk about the necklace though?
Yes. We're going to.
Oh, the stupid necklace. I hate that thing.
Okay. So yeah, it's a whole plot point.
It's so completely unnecessary.
Again, it is textbook drama. It is the MacGuffin. It is like James Cameron read one Alfred Hitchcock book and was like, oh, I know how to.
That's such a good way to describe how James Cameron makes movies. Like he understands what he does perfectly, but it's like he could go to the next level, but doesn't. Yeah.
He's like, Hitchcock, MacGuffin, something honestly, that all the characters care about. got it. Let's
he'd
bring up
rather
the necklace every 10 minutes.
Yeah, if he'd rather spend his other time inventing new cameras and new submarines, all the power to him. Like, that's what I try to explain to everybody about James Cameron. Like, he's so impressive as a technical guy. He just also happens to make movies. And he does make very good movies, but his main thing is like the tech. It's super cool.
Yeah, but the necklace was, definitely got very tiring. I was kind of okay with it as just like an arbitrary way to kick things off.
I cannot believe she threw it in the ocean. What the hell? Why would you do that?
It didn't mean anything. Like, the necklace we got like the faintest sense that this guy wanted it. I couldn't tell if he was like nefariously wanting it to sell it and get rich, or if he was interested in it as a historical artifact.
Yeah,
or
the expedition is never fully explained. Like, are they treasure hunting? Like, are they scavenging the Titanic? Or are they historical researchers who see this as a thing of value? But either way,
like they're scavengers pretending to be historians.
You know, especially as I've gotten older and the whole generational wealth thing has become more apparent. Why would you do that to your family? You have a necklace that's worth like probably like couple $1,000,000, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars at least. That's represents family wealth that could keep your family in good stead for a generation to come, and you just toss it in the ocean? What, do you hate your children? What the heck?
Also, she did it as like a romantic gesture, but also it like represents the dude that you hated, and
it was a vapid romantic gesture. It was pretty hollow. It just didn't matter by the end. It was like every time they brought it up, I was like, this freaking thing again. I don't care. It's started
it's like they're playing the pea in the cup.
Fine. But yeah, we just didn't need it at a certain point.
Yeah, but they keep bringing it up like it's a shock, like, and it's like, oh, I put the jewel in the jacket. Like, so what?
I put the jewel in the jacket of the girl.
Oh gosh.
I put the jewel in the jacket and the jacket on the girl, said Dumbledore calmly.
I did think that the other fiance character, Cal, he was a little over the top annoying, but also kind of enjoyably hateable.
Yeah, he's kind of cartoonishly villainy, isn't he?
Yeah, he was for most of it. Like when he slaps her, it's always like, oh, shocking, slapping a woman. And he's supposed to be this proper upscale guy. But then by the end, when he started shooting at them, I was like, okay, now I'm like into this villainy thing. Because
that's when he actually feels like properly like evil.
Yeah, and I thought that was another great moment where like the ship is sinking, we're already all in a life and death situation, and he's going to take this time to get in a shootout with these two. I was like, okay, this is kind of exciting. I'm down for this.
Yeah, that's some classic Hollywood nonsense, but it's fun classic Hollywood nonsense.
But regarding that whole thing of what happens when the chips are down, because it's a really interesting like microcosm bottle episode of like the type of story that's basically post-apocalyptic. It's the thing that once all the societal walls come down and there's no more rules, because it's
the purge.
Down to the line. It's the purge. It's like just watching which characters try to hold to those societal walls and which ones realize that it just doesn't matter anymore. But you get to see it in so many different ways in fast motion that it's really fascinating, because it is like, the people who are already well off are trying to like hold on to their dignity, and the people who were already screwed over are like, finally, we're like all equal now because we're all gonna die, right? And then the other people are like, no, actually, you still are below me, so die on the ship for all I care.
Hey, what happened to his friend who got on the ship with him? I just don't remember.
So he disappears for the whole love plot because that's too complicated. But he dies. How does he die? He helps them break through the gate to get to the upper level, and then let's see, because the Irish dude gets shot by the lifeboat guy, and then the lifeboat guy feels really bad about it and shoots himself. But the other friend who was Italian or something, I can't remember if he sacrifices himself somehow, but he dies in the kerfuffle.
Okay. I was like, wow, they did forget about him for a large portion of the film.
I really don't have all that much to say about the whole classism section of the film.
No, I mean, it's kind of like, and again, like it's a very clear and evident theme that works well enough for like one watch, but it's not very deep. Like the ramifications of it are essentially classism bad, which sure I agree with, but doesn't like doesn't expound on it, doesn't add anything to it, and that's again is just
I think part of the thing,
right?
Part of the thing is with it being a period piece, but our main conflict is with Rose and Rose's like crisis of identity. But Jack is more relatable than Rose. So
yeah, Rose is kind of a boring character
because she's just super rich and
she's super rich,
like trying to get off her high horse.
Yeah, she doesn't want to marry she doesn't want to do an arranged marriage, basically. And even at the beginning, it's not even that she like knows that her fiance is a bad guy and dislikes him. She just doesn't want to be forced to marry somebody she doesn't want to marry, which honestly, fair. I get that. But it's really hard to sympathize when she's so rich and could kind of do whatever she wants. Like, I mean, she kind of gets away with an affair on the boat for the most part. Not until she's like actively planning to run away with him does it become a problem.
I do like, if you pay attention to like when all of her high class people are like keeping really strict tabs on her, and then when they just disappear so that she can run around the boat with Jack, and it doesn't matter until it's convenient for them to almost get caught.
Right.
Yeah. I will say, watching it for the first time, I was very cognizant of like the structure and the runtime. And so I was trying to figure out, how are we going to fill 3.25 hours with a story about a boat that sinks in like 3 or 4 days. And so the exact middle point of the film is when they sight the iceberg.
Yep.
And so I was like, we had an hour and a half of like, Romeo and Juliet. And then for the next hour and a half, we get actually probably the expedition at the beginning probably takes half an hour.
They spend a lot of time on that setup.
It does take a while.
Cameron really wants to show off his subs.
So then maybe we have like an hour of Romeo and Juliet, and then right at the exact middle point of the film, we sight the iceberg. And so then we have another hour and a half of the sinking of the boat, which is actually a pretty interesting way to do it. It's probably a little less than that because there's a little bit at the end back on the research boat. But really that whole sequence of the boat sinking takes quite a long time. And so it is the spectacle climactic moment of the film, and I think it pays off because I mean it's very interesting to kind of, I guess, recreate what that kind of a catastrophe would have been like experientially, and so you can spend a long time on it without it feeling like it drags.
My favorite part of the sinking of the boat is seeing how everybody reacts to it, and I mentioned this a bit earlier, but like seeing the musicians decide to go down with the ship, seeing the designer decide to go down with the ship, or the captain. The priest who's praying as the stern of the ship slowly tilts and sinks, or the people who decide to stay in their rooms. Like all of that is very, very, very interesting.
The drunk chef who figures out how to stay on the rail at the top.
Yeah. Honestly, like all of the, and that's what makes all of these tragedy films so interesting, is seeing how a human meets with the unfathomable, right? No pun intended, because they're deep in the ocean. But like, what do you do in that situation that we don't comprehend or don't think about? Because the human mind just isn't meant to comprehend its own mortality. It's just not. So what do you do when you're faced with that so immediately? How do you react? Do you fall back to the things you've learned? Do you do something desperate? Do you just accept your fate? Do you fight? Do you fly? All that. So that's what makes so much of this so interesting. But also, Jonathan, we have to talk about it. Honestly, I'm kind of sick of talking about it at this point. I feel like it's been talked to death. But we have to talk about the door.
Oh, God.
Because it relates to the previous point, and the point of the tragedy. And the point is that when the chips are down, we find out that this wasn't just a fling for Jack. It was the real deal for Jack. He really loves her, or at least the adrenaline coursing through his blood after he got locked up, almost drowned. She chopped him off after he mansplained how to use an axe to her, and then survived being shot at and got out to the boat, not once but twice, fought the other guy again, got back to the boat, got with her in the water. All that he's decided he loves her for sure, for real. And we're meant to believe that he really truly does love her in this moment, that this is true love. So I don't want to besmirch that. That is the intent. Although my armchair psychological analysis is like, you've known each other for 3 days and you're coursing with adrenaline right now. So maybe not, but sure. But he decides he'll sacrifice himself for her, so she can stay on the door and survive. And of course, this is one of the great flaws with the movie, not because that's what happens, but because they used too big of a door, and they could have used a smaller door. And I think at this point, there's like been multiple interviews with Cameron where he's like, yes, I should have used a smaller door. I'm sorry. There's a whole Mythbusters episode about it. And essentially the way it boils down is that a door like that could have supported them both to keep them from sinking, but it would not have kept them both above the waterline and dry.
Yeah.
So if they had both been on it, there's a pretty good chance that they both could have died of hypothermia. Granted, it wasn't 100% chance, and Jack 100% would have died if he stayed in the water, and that's what happened. So, you know, it's one of those things, like the intent of the scene is very clear, but it's one of the great goofs in Hollywood history, I think, where it's like, oh, you could have just made that smaller and it wouldn't fit a problem, would it? Or just made it something different, something like the one life preserver, or something like that. Or, you know, there's a lifeboat that comes along and it can pick only one of them up, and Jack is like, you go, I'll stay behind, or something like that. Like there's other solutions that could have been thought through that a little bit. And it's almost kind of like been memed to death at this point, which is a bit of a shame. But it's one of those things we just have to mention, because it's one of the key beats of the tragedy is when Jack decides that he's going to die for her in that moment. But also that
I guess in a sense, Rose's moment of that is when she decides to jump off of the lifeboat with all the rich people on it. So she makes the decision that, you know, at that point in her mind is as good as committing suicide in order to stay with Jack and to rescue him. So in a sense, they both kind of give themselves up for each other, but he just gets the short end of the stick.
Yeah, that's how it goes. I will say, speaking of fate, how lucky is that guy who lost his tickets to Jack at the start of the movie? That dude must be like so happy right now.
This is the best game of poker he ever played.
Best hand he ever lost at a game of poker.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't even think about that. That's hilarious.
But yeah, that's the happiest moment in the whole movie. Well, that right after when the credits roll and you realize you don't have to watch Titanic anymore.
By the way, those two guys that he was playing poker with were named Olaf and Sven.
I was like that when I heard it this time around. It really sunk in. I was like, "Hey, wait a second."
And they had the accents and everything. Yeah, it was great.
Did Disney just take their names from Titanic? I mean, I know they're just like classic, like Scandinavian Nordic names, but it's also
yeah, it was pretty hilarious coincidence. Okay, so as we transition into overall, I think this is like I said, kind of towards the beginning of this one. It's like we have this event that in and of itself does not have a lot of meaning. As far as I know, there's not a whole lot of like feel good stories that come out of the survivors of the Titanic. Mostly, they were all very selfish rich people who let a lot of poor people die and not fill up the lifeboats. And so it's, as a storyteller, it's like, okay, so this is a very dramatic event, but how do we make it interesting? How do we sell a story this sad? And what we do is we superimpose this highly romantic, highly aesthetic story on top of it, which makes it a much easier sell than just a lot of people died for no reason, a la Grave of the Fireflies. Also, I think it's interesting that in a way, this film is also narrated by the ghost of the protagonist, because this lady who's 100 years old is, you know, her life after the events of this story don't really matter. And it's, you know, debatable that she basically died as soon as she finished telling the story. So it's almost like she's
I know,
looking
right?
back.
That's so weird.
It's almost like a ghost explaining like the past and all of that to these people, in just a little more of a.
Thanks for taking me all the way out to the Mid-Atlantic, daughter, to tell my story about that affair I had on a boat 70 years ago to this one dude. Now let me toss your inheritance into the ocean before I croak.
I was waiting for something like, and that's how your mother came to be, or something like that.
Yeah, I thought Jack was secretly going to be the father of her first kid or something. I mean, technically they didn't X that possibility, but still. They
did not. Yeah, so we have this superimposing of this romanticism, of this aesthetic over the story. So yeah, I think when we're talking about all of these stories, which are all very sad, lots of people dying, the main characters all die in these films, and it's like, from a marketing perspective, it's terrible. It's like, how are you going to get people to care about this? And so from these three films, the way that I see it is ways to market sad movies are A, make them pep rallies or some kind of a morality tale, like in Ikiru, where it's like, this is supposed to motivate you to get you to start living your life.
Man, the base nature of this man to call Ikiru a pep rally.
So you can either make them some kind of encouragement, like Ikiru. You can make them like a history lesson, like, you know, this is how it happened, and that was sad. Let's learn from it. Or you make them kind of aesthetically beautiful and give them an intrinsic enjoyability apart from the, I guess, concluding moments of the film, where even if the film doesn't end in an uplifting way, as long as you've had enough of an enjoyable time along the way, then that is kind of enough to hold it together. And Aristotle kind of talks about this in a way where he talks about problems and solutions, and the way that solutions are presented within stories. And he says, and this is something that we've talked about before in various episodes and stuff. But he says the poet must necessarily.
If you said that about anything, Jonathan, I would believe.
That's true. That's true.
But continue.
So Aristotle says the poet must necessarily, in all instances, represent things in one or other of three aspects, either as they were or are, or as they are said or thought to have been, or as they ought to be. And we've talked about this before, because we've talked about how some people seem to make things very realistic, and some people seem to kind of say this is what you should do or whatever.
Dude,
and it's
you
kind of
get
hard to
that-
parse that
You
sometimes.
get that just talking to people in everyday life. Sometimes I talk to people and they're like living in this fantasy world of how things ought to be. And I'm like, that's not how it is though.
Yeah.
Like
It's
people should
prescriptive
be
versus
doing this.
descriptive. It's idealism versus realism. But I think we kind of have that breakdown in these films. So
Yeah,
you
that's a
have
good
like
point.
things as they were or are. So you have Grave of the Fireflies. It's like, this is how it was. This is how it is. This is just life and death. And it's sad sometimes. You have things as they are said or thought to have been, which this is kind of broad, but I kind of take that to be like, you know, it's an imagining of what would have happened on the Titanic. If you don't know, this is how I think it would have been. Obviously, the story imposed on top of it is a little bit extra, but it's like, this is, you know, it's kind of the imaginary version or the self-perceived version. And then things as they ought to be is Ikiru. It's the kind of, this is the best case scenario. You know, he could have got his stomach cancer diagnosis and then gotten depressed and drank himself to death or whatever. But he took it as an opportunity to do something good, to leave a legacy, to impact his environment, and seeing the outcome of that. And so that's, again, not necessarily moralistically prescriptive, but it's supposed to paint a picture of a desirable path forward in similar circumstances. And so I think that's interesting, and it's a good way of framing the ways that we've tried to wrestle with this topic in a lot of different episodes in the past.
Yeah, I feel like this is a pretty good example of that. I guess, I don't know, Jonathan. Jonathan, here's a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you watch movies? Or read a book? Or play video games? Or go see a stage play?
Alex, you're opening a can of worms.
I know I am.
I think
Answer
we've
the
both
question.
I think we've both been contemplating this a lot lately. But I like experiencing stories and narrative for the in a sense building like a library of vicarious experience, and also
I was going to say something very similar.
Yeah, but it's also, and this is particularly true for literature, but it is assimilating a form of looking at the world that is very attentive to human nature and motivations. In literature, especially classic literature, there's such a good sense of the way that these authors, especially the ones that have lasted the test of time, they saw people and they saw behind their actions through to their motivations, and they were able to kind of string those together and how those actions and motivations impacted the other people around them and then the things that they did. And so it's kind of a fine-tuning of attention, and it is broadening lived experience vicariously.
Yeah. It reminds me of the quote. I'm sure it's from something important, or maybe it's just an internet thing that got popular. But the thing that, to paraphrase, goes along the lines of a man who doesn't read lives a life, but the man who reads lives 1,000 lives. So the idea of experiencing something vicariously and experiencing something that you definitely wouldn't have. Maybe it's just because it's somebody whose experience you never would have had. Like neither of you or I are rich Victorian age girls. We don't know what Rose's life is like in Titanic. But we get a peek into a window of how this character is portrayed and written, and how somebody of that age might have felt and acted. And that broadens our horizons. And also the idea of I think, if you watch movies empathetically and you build empathy,
Empathetically, specifically?
I think it doesn't have to start empathetically. I think if you experience enough different stories, it might broaden your horizons to the point where you can watch them empathetically.
Interesting.
But the idea that the world is not one thing, that the world exists through as many different lenses as the people who experience the world view it, as, and sometimes there's a lot of overlap and sometimes there's not. Like the way, and sometimes that changes over the course of a person's life, like seeing the way that Watanabe's worldview changes in Ikiru from the beginning to the end of the movie, and the way his coworkers' views almost change and then don't. Seeing the growth of people, and I guess all of this really just goes deeper into the idea of gaining experiences that you wouldn't have had otherwise. But to see that kind of builds and to really engage with it, which is what I mean by empathetically. So like actively watching instead of passively, like trying to dig into the meat and chew it on the bone if it's there in the movie, which good luck with Titanic. But the other two you could do.
There's something worth watching in Titanic.
There is once. That's it.
Okay, granted.
Yeah, it's a really good one-time watch, and maybe like 5 years in between rewatches, but it's not going to sit with you. Like Ikiru will haunt you for like a week or so afterwards, and you will learn something and gain something, hopefully, probably something valuable in your life from having watched that movie. You will watch Titanic and have had a popcorn and a Diet Coke, and that's it. But yeah, if you go through that process of actively watching movies or engaging in any literature, and really, really getting into what the author or the team behind it is trying to say or tell, regardless of whether or not you agree with them, you will sharpen your own worldviews and build the flexibility of your mind for the exercise of having done it.
Honestly, just experiencing literature and story with the possibility open of disagreeing with it is one of the mentally healthiest things you could do.
Yeah, you can read, and to go even further, Jonathan, there is the possibility, and I'm both ashamed and both and encouraged by how long it took me to realize this, but you can watch something and not wholeheartedly like it or wholeheartedly dislike it. You can choose
That's
to both
why
like
I don't
it
use
and
ratings.
at the same times. Yeah,
That's
that's why
why
ratings
I can't
don't
do
work.
ratings.
Right? Like it's why ratings don't work. You might like a lot of parts about a movie, but not like other parts about a movie. It's why I can say
a movie could be the most flawlessly executed piece of art ever, and it could have a just dreadful message.
Yeah.
And so how do you rate that?
Yeah, it's like how I can talk about Killers of the Flower Moon. Hey, Scorsese. And say this is a phenomenally well-made film that should not have been made this way. You know, there's to see those mixtures of good and bad things, and to realize that even the assignments of the terms good and bad are wholly subjective in this context is
nothing is either good or bad, but thinking makes it.
Yeah,
so.
Exactly. Right from Hamlet.
Yep.
Is one of the things I know is because your email signature for like 10 years. But it's one of those things that you develop by going through this process of actively engaging with any piece of literature, whether it be cinematic or otherwise. And it's to bring it back home, it's why we watch depressing ass movies because the value in watching it isn't to feel good necessarily, although there certainly are movies where the value is the good emotions they share, but there is value in experiencing the negative emotions as well, because as unfortunate as it is, the human experience, which is what you're trying to convey in art and literature, is not only positive stuff. It's not only the hedonistic positive things or the holistic positive things either. It is a mix of everything, and things that cannot be defined either, but only by your own lived experience and worldview and opinions formed can they be determined. So you need a mix of it all. You need the full pyramid diet of movies. You can't just watch blockbusters. I mean, you can, I guess, but if you want to be really like a healthy, active, engaged, literate cinema consumer, you shouldn't just watch blockbusters. You should watch a little bit of everything, old movies and new movies. You know, I hate when people, my family likes to get on me about how I only watch old movies. I'm like, well, how do you define old movies? If you define old movies as anything made more than 3 years ago, then yes, that's most movies.
It's like every time that
you need
like
a
a
mix
movie
of it.
theater is like, we're rerunning the classics in theater. Come see The Dark Knight on the big screen.
Yeah, it's like, no, that doesn't qualify. And it's not even about whether or not it qualifies as old. It's just you don't just watch the newest thing that came out just because it came out. Be selective with your viewing. Go find new stuff that you want to view. If you like blockbusters,
new
great.
old stuff.
There's like 50 plus years worth of blockbusters for you to check out that are all really cool. And you know what the great thing about watching old movies is? The sifting of whether or not this is a good movie has already been done. So you don't have to sit there and wonder about whether or not this movie is going to be relevant in 10 years like you are with a movie that just came out on Netflix. Hint, most of them won't be, because that's just the numbers game. You already know what the best movies from 1972 are, because they're the only ones people still talk about from 1972. So it's a pre-selected menu of these cumulative experiences that we're talking about engaging with and building that sense of empathy, literature, literary lyricism, and understanding about the world and how much you do and don't understand about the world. And you can get that through real life. You can get that through movies, but make sure it's a varied movie diet if you're doing it, and include tragedies, include stuff that makes you sad.
Yeah. Like, I know people who like will do the thing where they only will watch or experience movies or books that make them feel good. And there's a whole genre of like cozy fiction these days that's like literally just for turning your brain off and enjoying and feel good, and like just like, oh, I'm going to be best friends with these characters for the next 200 pages or whatever. And that's fine, but there's a balance in literature between the art and the edificial element to it. But I feel like there is a shift in the modern era towards more story that is solely based on producing emotion in a kind of experiential way. And I think that's because the element of vicarious experience that used to be almost exclusively provided through literature has now been pretty much replaced by the internet, in which you can experience other people's lived experience vicariously, like instantly, and every single person in the entire world.
Think of all the dash cam footage you can watch.
Dash cam footage, you can just scroll Instagram, you can read Reddit posts, you can join Discords. Like, there's so much human experience available on the internet that it seems like, I think there's kind of a unspoken sense that that function of literature is no longer needed. But I think part of the thing that literature and art is useful for is incorporating the perspective of the artist in that, and giving the sense of meaning on top of that observation of human experience, and not just the first person experience. Like that takes way too much sifting to just go through everyone's experience and try and make it add up to something. But that's what the artist is for. But yeah, it does take experiencing all the emotions to not just be like a one-sided experience of like, oh, everything is just entertainment, and then we die.
Yeah, I think one of the downsides of the a lot of the experiences you see online is that they're curated to be as interesting or clickable as possible, but not to engage you in the same way longer pieces of format are. So you're getting a really shallow diet of...
And it depends. There's a lot of different kinds of content online.
I'm not saying that there's not stuff worthwhile online. I'm saying Most of the stuff that's really easy and accessible and that you're going to pour through like 30 reels of in 10 minutes while you're scrolling TikTok, it falls into that category. So there's a difference between someone just posting a thing that happened in third person observation and something that's been constructed to show progression and character and empathy and all the tools we talk about when we talk about the art of filmmaking.
And like we said last time, it's patterns of behavior that have been observed over time rather than single instances.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Right? Because one instance can always be taken out of context.
Yeah. The other thing to mention, I guess, before moving on to what we're going to be talking about next time is that this is the last. So the next 2 episodes are all going to be much more tangible. They're going to be man versus man conflicts in 2 different ways. So this is the last of the, we had self, we had injustice, and we had fate. These are the ones that are less like, tete-a-tete kind of conflicts. So I don't know if there's anything to be said about these conflicts where it feels like, I guess in all 3 of those instances, the protagonist feels isolated in a way. Like if you are up against a power structure that is insurmountable, you feel just as isolated as if your main antagonist is your own self or is just the fate and circumstance or providence of where you happen to be at a particular time or whatever it is. And so in the next couple of episodes, it's going to be a lot easier to kind of point fingers and talk about our relationships with other human beings. But in these, it's about observing reactions to situations in which you more or less can only count on yourself, and then you have to choose who your allies are because the antagonist is hard to defeat or impossible to defeat.
Yeah. I mean, hey, so many of the factors that determine where you are at a given point in the life are not up to you, that we're all victims or benefactors of fate in one way or the other, probably both at any given state and time, right? So even if we don't experience tragedy to this level or, lottery luck to this level, then you're still experiencing it in some way, shape, or form.
It's kind of like these stories are almost, they're a buttressing against the slings and arrows that may or may not be inevitable.
Man's got a quote.
Apparently all the Hamlet is coming out today.
Yeah. Man, you guys really should get an email from Jonathan sometimes. There's just like a full Shakespeare play down there.
Signed, Jonathan. Our play takes place in fair Verona.
Anyway, what are we talking about next time on the show, Jonathan?
Next time, we are, like I mentioned, talking about the conflict of man versus man, and we're breaking that into 2 sections. One is intentional and one is unintentional. So to start off with, we're talking about the intentional antagonism of man versus man and tragedies of betrayal. And we've got another Japanese film. We've got Ikiru Kurosawa and Studio Ghibli in this episode, and we have Yasujiro Ozu next time with Tokyo Twilight from 1957. From what I hear, I have not watched this one yet, but from what I hear, it is one of his darkest and saddest films, which makes it perfect for this series. Then we're talking about In the Mood for Love from 2000. And finally, we're going to give you guys a little bit of a break. It's still, I think it's going to fit into our categories in the way we have defined them Aristotelianly. But we're going to talk about S.S. Rajamouli's RRR from 2022. It is a wild Bollywood ride, and it is also a lot of fun. So we will have a little bit of a reprieve from the sadness to talk about next time. But hope y'all come back and join us.
Well, that's about the time we have for this episode.
To find links to things that we talked about today, as well as a complete list of past episodes and all 504 films we've covered so far, visit thefilmlings.com.
You can also join us for ongoing film discussions on our Discord server.
And to stay posted about upcoming episodes, follow us at the Filmlings.
Summaries for this week's episode were recorded by me, Blue Jay. You can discover everything I do at thebluejayproject.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya. There's a lot
Jonathan,
packed into
stop
it.
putting 3-hour movies on the podcast. I know I did the Jacques Rivette episode. I'm sorry. You've made your point. We do not have to have a 3-hour plus movie every episode.
Okay. There may or may not be one next time.
Damn it, Jonathan.
And it's even worse because it's Bollywood.
Oh, well, that doesn't count. That's like, there's no brain involved. It's just music and explosions. I know, actually, yeah, I remember exactly which one you're talking about. There's in terms of like dialogue scenes, there's going to be like 20 minutes, and it's going to be like the rest of it will be musical extravaganza. So that's different. Musicals are one of the few things that can. No, I just know enough about it to know that it's going to be insane.
Yeah,
it's one of the ones that like clips get shown everywhere. So that's different.
Yep.
That's different. It's not 3 hours of Killers of the Flower Moon or 3 hours of Titanic, which actually honestly has action in it, but I've seen it so many times. more than I wanted to.
I am fascinated because I had never seen this film before.
I was so surprised when you said that. I like, how have you not seen Titanic?
Because Taylor always makes fun of me for not watching it, but then she won't watch it with me. So
why? Because she agrees with me that it's overblown, or because it's sad?
Yeah. I mean,
it's
a little bit of both.